Hello and welcome to the Ripping Pages podcast. This is the podcast where we have a coffee with the world's most interesting writers to inspire your reading and your writing. It's all crafted and curated by me, Liam Bishop. Today we really are having a coffee with one of the world's most interesting writers. It's time again for one of our live coffee conversations. We're talking to Deepa Anappara live in London. But it's 1869, not here, but in the book that we're going to be discussing. Tibet is a forbidden kingdom and closed to foreigners. Tibet is also an unwilling participant in what was called the Great Game, a geopolitical rivalry, shall we call it, that didn't escalate into a full-scale war, but it did see both Russia and the United Kingdom trying to expand their territories. As she brings to life what was at stake for those explorers who, conceitedly and ambitiously, crossed those borders. Deepa takes us on a sweeping journey back into the history. For me, what I loved about this novel, though, Deepa, is that it is for sure a prescient exploration of boundaries and borders, but it's also a hymn to the complicated emotion of grief, as well as that it's just a really good example of good storytelling. Your previous novel and debut novel, Jin Patrol on the Purple Line, was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, was named as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and NPR. She's also co-edited Letters to a Writer of Colour, a collection of personal essays on fiction, race, and culture featuring writers such as Madeleine Thien and Xiaolu Guo. Deepa, delighted to welcome you on the Ripping Pages.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Liam.
How was your journey in?
It has been okay. It was okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad we could get this together. And this is another one of the live coffee conversations that we're having on the Rippling Pages, and we've got this nice stack of books here. We're going to get into some of these, but before we get going, I'm just going to remind everyone that if you enjoy this episode or any previous episode of the Rippling Pages, please let us know. Let us know by leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast provider. When you do that, you can leave a comment, you can leave a question, tell me what you enjoyed, tell me who you'd like to see on the show, tell me what you love about Deepa's work. But otherwise, Deepa, should we get into it?
Sure.
Okay, so you sound a little bit nosy, okay?
I'm okay, yeah.
What I want to start on is the mountains. And we start high up in the Himalayan mountains. Imaginatively, you are just in this incredibly expansive space. Can you just give us a bit of an idea, Deepa, how you piece this together and how you started building this world?
I have visited the Himalayan mountains from the Indian side. When I lived in Delhi, even today, it's very common for people to travel to the mountains if you have a long weekend. So the mountains are, it's like a getaway space.
Yeah.
And the air is much cleaner. You can imagine Delhi is very polluted. So people tend to go up to the mountains. So I was familiar with the Indian Himalayan side. And parts of the Indian Himalaya, which is in this region, the capital is Leh. The geographical region there, the landscape is very similar to Tibet.
Wow.
So that was my, initial understanding or initiation of Tibet, because I only visited Tibet after I wrote the novel.
Yeah.
Before I started writing it, I had to have an idea of, what the altitude might be like, and it's like a mix of desert and mountain landscape, and what that would be like. So I could only understand that through the experience on what is today the Indian side of it was called Little Tibet in the 19th century.
So you didn't go until after they'd written the novel. So when you started writing there, how did you build up a picture of what this world was like in the 1800s?
So the first part for me was to understand the landscape, really, because it's a novel about geographies and a person's experience, like the character's experience of that landscape. So understanding that was the first part for me, really. And it was helpful that I had traveled in those areas, including the border areas. So India has a border with Tibet. So I had traveled up to there. And the early survey expeditions, which the British ran from India, that place, I traveled up to the Tibetan borders. I had a good understanding of the geographical landscape. Then I read a number of books. So this book involved a lot of research. So I read a lot of 19th century accounts of traveling from, parts of the Indian subcontinent. Because it was in India as we know it today, obviously in the 19th century, even though the British at that time were bringing these different kingdoms together. But the good thing is that the British kept meticulous records. So everything that they did in India or any of the colonies, there were always records.
Oh, okay.
And those records were obviously curated. So it's, that is a bad part, that it's not really the truth, but it is the truth that the colonizer wants others to perceive. But those records are there, and they're still there at the Survey of India, which is in Dehradun today.
Right.
And that is actually the government official, the official department for doing surveying and mapping within India today.
Right.
But previously it was under the British, and they used it for, their projects, which were usually to do with furthering the imperialist ideas and, pushing through, like creating a more expansive empire. And part of that was achieved through map making.
The political dimension then. Well, it sounds like there was a political dimension to map making. Map making is a very political enterprise, it sounds like.
It's always been that way. And I think we forget that because, even to get here, I used Google Maps today. And we expect that it is a very, it's an objective representation of the landscape. That's how we see maps, but it's not really like that. Especially in the 19th century, we can see how maps were used to create this idea of, that the British Empire is everywhere. And you can see these insignia in the maps. So one part of my research was looking at the maps that were created at that time.
Yeah.
And you can see that, apart from the description of, mountains and rivers, the routes that are mapped on the map, on the sides, there would be various insignia. And typically it would be like an Indian bowing their head before an Englishman. So not so subconscious, it's not even like, it's not subtle. It's a very overt representation of who is superior through these maps. And of course, we very famously know that even the current maps that we have it's not the actual geographical size of the continents. So countries in Europe look much bigger than, the countries in Africa. And it's all been changed to make it look like the Western countries are much superior.
So where are these maps at? Did you look at them?
Yes, I did. So some of them are here at the Royal Geographical Society. Okay. So they have archives, and many of these maps and the original letters can be seen there. What the British officials did was to put together these maps. The Indians would go into Tibet and bring back information. Then a British officer would put the map together. Typically, they would read a paper at the Royal Geographical Society, and it would be published in the Royal Geographical Society's journal. And we can see the maps in the Royal Geographical Society's journals. We can see the original letters and the maps that they put together in these, in the archives at the Royal Geographical Society, the British Library, and at the Survey of India.
And so you spoke then about this idea of there was some really overt prejudice, I guess, to some extent within those original maps. And for you looking at these maps and writing this novel, what kind of feelings did that stir? I guess, where did the story come from? Did it come from looking at these maps and going, oh, there's a really interesting story to tell? Or was it more were the maps a process that you started looking at when you started writing the novel? I'm trying to get an ascertain what your feel, because you sound like it must have been really interesting to discover all of these and go into these archives. But where did then the story start? When did you start plotting out that?
It started with this Englishman's account that I found in a secondhand bookshop in Leicester Square, which doesn't exist anymore. But they had a Southeast Asian section, and I found this book. It was in 2 volumes. It cost £25, which is a lot more than I usually pay for books. But I actually did pay because I was so fascinated by his story. And it's about him traveling to Tibet in the 19th century with 2 Indians. And I was fascinated by that relationship between the Indians and this Englishman who was very arrogant. He was a very stereotypical Englishman. At least that's what I could perceive from what he had written. He seemed very arrogant, very certain of what he was doing and why it was important to do these things, to go into Tibet. And, he was actually a Daily Mail correspondent. And he used to But the Indians were keeping him alive, and he did not see them as his equals. But at the same time, he says he was very grateful for their work, but then he also talks about whipping them. And I thought that's a contrast. That's really, fiction is a good space to explore those kind of contradictory emotions and sentiments. And then, but then once I started looking into expeditions into Tibet in the 19th century, I found out about how the British trained Indians to conduct these very secret, covert spying expeditions in Tibet. So for them, they were afraid that the Russians would enter India through Tibet. So they wanted to push back Russians. So they wanted geographical knowledge, because that awareness of, that spatial knowledge of, so which is why they sent Indians to collect all that information.
Gosh, how fascinating. I mean, then you've uncovered quite a lot. Well, you've uncovered loads, but in terms of, there is this sense of conflict, a greater conflict. And you see some of that in the novel, but there's a real sense of a great conflict happening around. It may be a conflict of ideas, conflict of it's a territorial conflict on some level. I guess it makes me think about the idea you're speaking about, the idea of maps as political. Mm-hmm. That has informed somewhat of what we know about the world today.
So in terms of distances, or, where a mountain or a lake is located, maps can be quite accurate. But some of the things that maps can't see are the kind of relationships that may exist between a line that's drawn as a border. And particularly in South Asia, what we see is that these borders, to this day, they create a lot of conflict. Mm-hmm. And these were often drawn by the colonizer. We are seeing that everywhere in the world, really, because these were drawn by people who didn't have an understanding of the landscape. The Indians were really just doing the grunt work of calculating what the distances are, but what the map looked like and how it appeared, how it was presented to the world, that was all curated by the British officers.
Goodness gracious. It makes you think, doesn't it? It makes you think. We'll come back to maybe maps and charting territories, because let's focus on some of the characters. And we've mentioned a few there, but you've got this captain, who is a very interesting character, but then you've also supported by this team and a chap called Balram. Can we talk about those two for a moment and their relationship?
So the story did start with these two characters, because that was the question that I really wanted to answer through the novel, which is what would their relationship have been like, and particularly away from the site of the empire, because within the empire there are all these structures that protect the colonizer, but in a landscape like Tibet, which is very isolated, and the average altitude of Tibet is 13,000 feet. So it's incredibly high, and if you're not used to it, you don't get enough air in your lungs.
It's higher than the Yorkshire Dales, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's higher than what's out in Essex. But it's a very high. Sorry to be flippant.
This is like sea level, or probably we are essentially at sea level, I guess, here. And in Tibet, you're looking at 13,000, 15,000 feet above sea level. But I saw the captain as someone, because he had already done different surveys in different parts of the Himalayan mountains, which are, very high. The altitude can be high in other parts as well. And I also, as I said, I did not want to make him a cliche, or, in some ways, at least, I tried to move away from that, I hope. Because I think many people did see it as a scientific exploration, and there was no understanding about why the ways in which, the relationship that the indigenous people have with the landscape, the way in which they may see ghosts or monsters, that it points to something else. It points to a spiritual and a sacred connection. That doesn't necessarily make it irrational. But that was not something, English people would have, at least the English officers there saw at that time, because so they did see map making as a very scientific process. So I wanted to portray an Englishman who had taken great risk, because, I always joke about this, that I know it's very cold here. It can be very gloomy, but to be spending that kind of time in these very isolated, very difficult areas, it takes a different kind of person. So I was also interested in understanding what might have motivated him. Was it just an idea of legacy? Was it an idea of, interest in what he thought was scientific progress? Was it just colonialism and this idea that, you're a different species than the other humans? So I was interested in looking at all those questions through the perspective of Captain, even though he doesn't have a viewpoint in the novel.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the novel does have this quite heady quality to it. There is a feeling of sort of, I wouldn't say intoxicating effect based, but there's a ethereal, spectral quality to the novel. But in terms of the Captain, one of the three epigraphs to the book, you've got Kipling, Melville, and Eliot. I think Eliot gives the title.
The title, The Lost of Earth. Yeah, it's from
Giving. Well, I want to talk about that because it's a really interesting poem, what Eliot is talking about in relation to this. But also, you've got this Captain, and it's very hard to avoid that feeling of it. It reminded me of Ahab in Moby Dick.
Moby Dick was a big influence on the book. Reading Moby Dick every day I was writing the novel. I'm not sure. I didn't want the Captain to be exactly like Ahab. I wanted him to have a more rational side, a more rational understanding as a man of, as he sees himself as a man of science. So I did want to portray that. And I hope by the end of the book, when we hear more from him, there's more of an understanding of why he may have done some of the things that he has.
We don't get that from Ahab, do we? But it's just what's also made me think about Melville was this idea of how you seem to, and I noticed this in Jin Patrol on the Purple Line, how you nomenclature, naming things. And Moby Dick is obviously this very famous opening line about whether the character, the narrator names themselves. But the Captain doesn't have a name. He's the Captain. And I think he's the only person in the book that doesn't have a name. And I don't want to focus too much on the colonizer too much within. And if we think also to the maps, what is given a tag, and how that is referred to.
It's something you can do as a fiction writer, I guess, because in real life, actually people do remark on names quite a lot, because, with Indian names, of course, the Western audience might not know what the name actually means, but people might say, your name actually means, say for Deepa, it's related to light and brightness. So people might say, oh, you're a very gloomy person, though you have this name. And so when I pick characters' names, I really think about their character and, what are their traits and whether they represent the name that they have. With the Captain, I was very sure I didn't want to name him because, all the accounts are by British officers, and the Indians are never named. So to this day, we don't know the full names of many of the Indians who actually went into Tibet. And with this book, what I really wanted to do was to write a 19th century novel. That was really my intention. I wanted to write a 19th century book using many of the conventions of that time, something that would speak to the 19th century Victorian adventure novel, but also, subverting some of the tropes.
Yeah, it does do that. And the register sometimes has that Victorian diction, I guess, which I find interesting because if you think about, letters to a writer of colour, some of the essays in there, what they say about the Western canon, that seems quite, what's this relationship you have with West? And maybe this is where we talk about Eliot's poem, because that is quite an interesting poem to choose that gives a title to the book.
With Eliot's poem, those lines are actually quite famous, aren't they? Because what he's saying is that, essentially he's saying we come to the end of our explorations when we return to ourselves. So the last of earth left to discover is that which was there at the beginning. And I felt that spoke in many ways to me, it speaks to the themes of the novel. And it also speaks in some ways to the imperialist impulse. Even though it was Eliot who wrote it, but in some ways he seems to be saying that there's no point in, traveling around the world if you're not really looking within. Which is why I picked the lines for the epigraph, because I really felt that if you read, if a reader comes across that in the first page, then they understand what the book is going to be about. It's not a typical adventure novel at all. In many ways, it's asking these philosophical questions, which is my big debt to Melville, because Moby Dick is, it is a chase and it's a quest novel in very basic form, but, he takes so many. Yeah, I guess the novel was not popular when it was published, and I wonder if that's because there are so many digressions and spend so much time telling you about the different types of whales and the different ways in which you can cut a whale and, slice a whale, and you might lose the reader if you do that. But part of the reason why I was reading Melville when I was writing my novel was to give myself that courage, that this is not just, I don't have to follow these, the ideas that may be in very modern, perhaps popular fiction, that the character has this very clear trajectory and we don't really stop to look within. I felt that in a journey, as as is the case on Pequod, you were spending a number of hours just by yourself. I mean, sure, you have people around, but it's the same thing if you're climbing a mountain or going on a trek. You have a number of hours in which you're essentially with yourself. And there's the exhaustion, but it's also like, it's time to think.
Yes, and that's making me think about Catherine, who I really want to spend quite a bit of time talking about. And there is a real sense sometimes that these characters are, so that sometimes you can feel more lonely when you're surrounded by people. And that's how I felt about some of the characters, but particularly Catherine. And I think what we might do is we'll speak about Catherine after the break. Do come back. Please come back, Deepa. That'd be great. So I'm not just talking into the wall. But we'll talk more about The Last of Earth. Okay, did you know that there's a Rippling Pages Patreon? For a small monthly fee, you can get exclusive member benefits, including Rippling Pages merchandise, specially curated craft insights, and an exclusive private podcast for Patreon subscribers, and exclusive reveals of upcoming guests before anyone else. And what you're going to get actually is you're going to get a close read of Deepa's book. So tap if you're listening to this. There's a big heavy hardback here, so you're going to get a nice close read of a passage within Deepa's book. Okay, shall we get back into it? Let's get back into The Last of Earth, and let's get back into speaking about this with the writer of that book, Deepa Anappara. Welcome back to the Rippling Pages. I'm literally here with Deepa Anappara. We're talking about her novel, The Last of Earth, published by One World Publications. We've had a top-up of coffee, and we're going to get back into this, Deepa. And I've got loads to talk to you, loads to talk with you about. So let's get into it. How was your break, Deepa? Did you have a nice break?
I did.
Good. You feeling ready for more?
Yes.
Good. Well, I want to talk, before the break, I wanted to talk about Catherine. And she is a very interesting character for lots of reasons. Can we just start by asking who she is and why she's up here in the mountains?
So Catherine is a biracial woman. She has an Indian mother, and then she has an English father. She has been traveling to what she calls the Orient, which would have been, parts of India, Sri Lanka, China. She has an interest in the region, which she hasn't quite unpacked as to the reasons why. So she sees herself as a female explorer, working in the same genre as, say, the Daily Mail correspondent. But she's very aware of the limitations and that she is, she has to face the restrictions that she has to face because she's a woman in Victorian society. And one of the interesting things I read was that many of these women, when they came back to London, they would go to church. They would always have chaperones when they traveled around. So they had to portray this, this image of someone who closely followed rules. And that just because they traveled to these far-flung places, it didn't mean that, they didn't follow the rules of society. So I was interested in thinking about these women, who had to wear corsets and long skirts and up there in Tibet, and how they would have undertaken those journeys.
Wow.
So Catherine really came from some of the women who had traveled to Tibet. I read about that in my research, and I knew I wanted that to be part of the story.
Wow. There's a lot of complex elements to her history, and you get hints toward that putting her down on the page, how was it like balancing that level of complexity then of a character? Because the captain is quite different to that, I would say.
In some ways, thematically, you can see some similarities in what the captain says and what Catherine is thinking about. In some chapters, you can see that their responses to events are quite the opposite. So the captain has the strong belief in numbers and in distances and maps because he sees that as a scientific method of surveying, whereas Catherine feels that one's observations may be more true. And I think it's, in some ways, as fiction writers, we say that fiction contains more truths than, say, nonfiction, and fiction can be a place where we can be more truthful, for instance. So there is that. It's not quite that they are entirely different. In some ways, they are doing almost the same work, but in terms of how they view the landscape, there is some difference. And for Catherine, that's partly because she is of a mixed heritage, and she has felt othered because of that. It doesn't make her necessarily closer to Indians or closer to understanding the colonized experience, but she does have that sense, which the captain doesn't have, of not always feeling like, you are the central power or the central figure in any landscape. And Catherine, as a character, she has quite a lot of interest in Buddhism and Buddhist scriptures, and that's also informed how she views the world.
Is that there is a slight mirroring effect in terms of the lines that they mark, but also how we display that and how we edit that, or how that's edited. But also surrounded by people supporting this journey, which is fundamental. Otherwise, they wouldn't get into Tibet, would they?
The men typically had entire contingent. They called them bearers, who would carry their luggage. They went with everything. I mean, sometimes they went on hunting expeditions. They had beds, people carrying mattresses and tables and everything. But the women typically traveled, their entourage was much smaller. So it would just be one or two people. And it would have been it would have been a much greater risk than it was for the men, because typically they only had, men going along with them. So they would have had to be quite certain of that they wouldn't be taken advantage of. In fact, in one of the accounts that I read, there's, someone who went into Tibet, a woman who went into Tibet, and she was very evangelical idea of spreading Christianity. And she had 2 Chinese servants who did cheat her and, who revealed her true identity to the Tibetans. So, so there are all sorts of dangers that, apart from the landscape, the women would have faced other dangers, but it didn't stop them from going there. There is this French-Belgian woman named Alexandra David-Neal, who has written many books about Tibet. She traveled to Tibet, I think, 4 or 5 times. And the last time she went to Tibet, she was 70 years old. And she went with this young man whom she later adopted as her son. So Catherine's figure was very much inspired by her.
The dynamic then so there's this dynamic to get in, they have to disguise themselves. How does Catherine negotiate that? Because these are some of the challenges that she faces.
So Catherine does look more like an Indian, and Indians could travel to Tibet freely. There were no restrictions. The Tibetans could, always allow Indians to enter, because trade between both countries or regions, because they didn't see themselves as countries at that time, it was quite common. So what Catherine is unable to admit is the extent to which she looks Indian, because she has grown up in London, and I think she has someone who has repressed the Indian side so that she fits into the society in London much more easily. So these questions come up when she is in India.
And Catherine, I asked that because Catherine, we see some of this in the sort of internal rumination, but there's a meta level to Catherine's story, because she writes a diary, self-editing. She self-edits this diary, and you strike through, don't you, the lines, and this reveals. I thought that's quite an ironic idea of how things are revealed about character, people, places.
Through Balram's perspective, I was trying to point to what might be missing in the archives and in these very scientific maps, which are meant to be, it's like a gathering of true evidence, which is present, factual evidence that's present. in the landscape, but actually what is it that's not being looked at? That's what Balram's perspective shows. And with Catherine, I was looking at what might the female or the woman explorer, what is it that they're not comfortable sharing?
It's brilliant. It's just really brilliant storytelling. You got so much going on. It's a big novel, but it's not as big as Moby Dick, that's for sure. There's balancing a lot of complexities, and what leaks through. I guess that's the question that you're asking: what leaks through, what doesn't leak through about, and what's inferred, and what do we understand, and how much does the reader know, and what doesn't come through. And that seems to be then a bit of a question that you've asked in how you're approaching the archives. The novel is about, ultimately, to some extent, what is left out of how we understand the world, how we understand people. There's a section about, it's about 257 pages in, I think, and that's when she's talking about her sister Ethel. And I guess this is another layer to that. She had a sister that died, and this idea of the bardo and this a limbo kind of space, which I think Tibetan.
I think it's 40 days after death.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And it feels like that this space in the mountains is some form of. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of ghosts. They have to carry the bodies, as you said, they're called bearers, which is quite a funereal word, really. But Catherine has, she lost her sister.
I think she feels a lot of guilt about her sister's death. The fact that the sister has 2 children and she doesn't, Catherine doesn't have kids, which is why she's able to travel the way that she can. And this is something that I really found about female explorers, that some of them were not even married. And I think that did give them some leeway to go out into the world. With Catherine and, in Tibet, because Catherine is reading Tibetan Buddhist texts, and she's trying to understand how Tibetan Buddhism makes sense of death and loss. And the idea of impermanence is kind of core. It's at the heart of Buddhism. It's something very difficult to absorb or imbibe when, you are grieving yourself. The notion that everything is impermanent doesn't really bring you peace, but she is struggling with that question. And, when she's spending all these long hours by herself, she is working through some of those questions that are there in her about whether she could have done more, whether she should have been present. So just like the captain is thinking about what is making him travel through Tibet, I think Catherine is in some ways negotiating that question.
Yeah, it really. Well, yeah, I think you see it in the psychology of Catherine, but you also see it in these diary entries. And the fact that she strikes through some of what her thoughts are on her sister shows that she's really struggling with these ideas, as you said.
It's also that her previous books were letters to her sister, and they were published as letters to her sister. So her 2 previous books about traveling through the northeastern parts of India, and the second book is about traveling through Tibet. Those were written as letters to her sister, and then they were published. And the third time, she's struggling to find a form. She is an unsuccessful novelist. She's written a novel that didn't work. And so this time she's going in with a lot of anxiety and trepidation about how she's going to present this work if she can't write to her sister. And the strike-throughs also are a way in which we are seeing how she's struggling to find her voice.
It's that thing of, it feels like there's a sense of company in the mountains, but she's very alone alone up there and out there, and in the world. Is it a form of grief then? Because you spoke about the ideas of the sense of impermanence and Buddhist teachings, but is this a form of, would you call this grief then, or?
I think she has always been interested in traveling, and she is someone who's done that for a long time. And it is for her because she doesn't really understand the structures of society otherwise, and it is when she's away from all that she feels most like herself. But on this journey, because it follows the death of her sister, she is being chased by a different set of ghosts, perhaps.
Is that a form of grief?
It might. She's grieving.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
for sure.
Okay.
I should add that she is hoping for some answer to that grief while she's walking through these mountains, and perhaps this idea that if she can see see Potala Palace, it's not just about ambition, but it's also about making it feel as if the huge sacrifices that she has made in terms of moving away from her family and going on these expeditions and not being near her sister. Perhaps it will, all this will have some meaning. So this is a way in which she's explaining it to herself. So it could be a displacement of the actual emotion of grief.
And is it?
I'm going to leave it to the reader to figure it out.
It just seems interesting because what we said about still seems to be something in that pursuit that is meaningful, at least. Think about the complexity of these characters, their identity. Think about Catherine. I'm just thinking back to those essays that you edited.
For me, when I was reading the essays, some of what was clarified for me was that my experience was not an isolated one. Sometimes it can feel like, are you responding to something because you're a sensitive person? Are you sensitive about your art? Or are you sensitive to criticism? Is it that you're unable to take on board feedback that's based on, objective feedback, let's put it that way? What I understood was that many of them were, looking at the same questions, facing the same challenges. And what a book like this does, what Letters does, I think it makes you feel less isolated. You can feel that you're going mad otherwise. And I've had that experience.
Yes.
When you're in a workshop and you're the only person, who's from the global majority and everybody else is white. And then they don't understand what you're writing about, or they will ask for explanations, even though those explanations will be in some ways redundant because your character knows all this.
Yes.
In the West, those questions are not discussed. They're not there in any creative writing handbook, which are very based on, it's centered on a very Western viewpoint. And I always say this, when someone is, as a brown person in this country, if someone is being mean to you, you never know, is it because they're being racist or is it just that they're having a bad day? You can't tell, so you have to give and it's somewhat similar when it comes to writing. If someone is saying they don't get what you're doing, you don't know, has the writing failed or is it coming from a lack of understanding of your culture, of the world in which your characters live? What this book did for me was to tell me that I was not isolated, I was not mad. Everyone is going through these things. So for me, what it did was, it really told me that, I could write the way I wanted. It was okay to do that.
Because it is a book about, it can help anyone about writing, but there's so many core personal experiences that, and the way that you write about your personal experience of your sister, of losing your sister, and how other people write about. Because I don't think I've read like a book of criticism where I've learned so much about writing, but I've learned so much about people's different experiences of trying to get published and writing, and also some of their personal challenges in.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so pleased to hear that. Not in terms of, the challenges people had to face, but that it really spoke to you because, everyone says it's difficult for everybody in the industry, and that is true.
Yeah.
It is a difficult industry. It's difficult for anyone to get a break or to be published or to have a career in these days of AI and everything else. But I think there are a very particular set of challenges that you face when you're writing about a non-Western country, and if you're from a non-Western culture. And that is, I have not seen it put into words, which is why my co-editor and I felt that this book was really necessary. And I hope, what it does for people is to make people feel less alone and to search out communities, because I think like building community is really important, especially if you're from a marginalized group, and that includes working class writers as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, your essay that you're writing there focuses a lot about you and your sister. And you talked about that idea of feeling alone. In writing this book, then, how was that experience of loneliness? Because it's quite a big book about loneliness, I thought. How was that experience felt for writing this book?
It was, I put everything in the book, I would say.
Okay.
So my sister was diagnosed with cancer when I was writing Gin Patrol on the Purple Line. And she was ill for a long period. And so when I started writing Catherine, she was quite ill. Yeah, I lost her around, she died when I was partway through the book, I think. And I really felt that it had to go into my writing because it was something that I was experiencing, and it is, I didn't want to do, say, auto fiction. I didn't want to write about myself and what I was experiencing. But in some ways, it actually helped me write the character of Catherine because I'm not mixed race. And, I haven't lived the 19th century, which is true for all the characters in the book. But the way for me to feel closer to the character was to write someone who was undergoing exactly what I was, which was, my sister was younger than me. She's my only sibling. And then trying to write about, and I was living in this country, and during the lockdowns, I couldn't be with her because flights, everything was canceled. Also trying to make a career in writing. I mean, who does that?
Well, you're doing it. You're doing it.
But it felt like Catherine's narration, Catherine's perspective gave me a chance to really think through some of those questions in my head. And I felt closer to her as a result, which I hope has helped the book.
Yeah, I think this is what I was wondering, really, because of all, Catherine is a member of the imperial class, and we're critical of some of her aims, but there's a real depth to her that, and like I said, I really felt this. I mean, all the characters, she's a really deep character, and I like I said, I pored over a lot of her passages for quite a long time because there's a real depth of emotion and that loneliness that I felt, or the kind of spirituality, I guess, of what she's trying to explore. Certainly did come through. And it's very emotional. There's real pathos to it.
I think anyone who's lost someone really close to you, especially if that person is younger than you, would have an understanding of what that loss feels like, because it's almost like nobody else understands what you're going through. The people can't understand that. So it's a very strange kind of loneliness. So in many ways, you have your friends, you have your family. There might be others sharing your grief, who are connected to that person. But that experience that you have is very particular. Your sister's experience is very particular. And it's a different kind of loneliness.
Well, thank you for sharing that. But the novel then is it's such a central novel. It's really evocative. Catherine's experience in the world. She feels it as well on some level. And when we feel it, we feel like we're there. It is a cliche, but we feel like we're there. We're in the mountains with her, and it feels like we're occupying some of her space sometimes. And I hope that perhaps people, I don't know, take something from Catherine's experience at least. I don't know if that's what you hope for.
I was hoping for an answer for myself.
Okay.
This is how I write. It doesn't always work that way, but I will say that for me, this book, irrespective of how it does in the world or how readers respond to it, Tibetan Buddhists, how do they understand loss and how do they understand grief? And I thought that was really helpful for me to see beyond my immediate experience. In that, grief can be isolating, as we just talked about. But to see how, other people understand grief and what's the role spirituality plays in understanding that as someone who's quite agnostic.
Well, it's a fantastic novel, and as you can tell, it's got so many layers to it. As you can tell, people have got to go out and read it. If you're not inspired to do so now, then it is a fantastic. I mean, I've read it several times now, and want to read it more now that we've spoken. But well, in any case, The Last of Us is out now. It's a big, beautiful hardback. Go out and buy it. But for now, Deepa, thank you very much for joining me on Everything Pages.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.